Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we return once again to the forgotten folds of history, in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed listening with closed eyes in a favorite chair, or perhaps walking through the gentle darkness of your evening routine, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here with me. If you're new to our little corner of the internet, welcome. If you've been here before, thank you for returning. I find such comfort in knowing that somewhere out there you're listening to these whispered stories of the past, allowing them to wash over you like waves on a distant shore. Please, if you feel moved to, share in the comments where you're listening from tonight, or how these stories have become part of your evening ritual. There's something deeply beautiful about this invisible community we've created together. Tonight our journey takes us to a city that existed between worlds, neither fully Eastern nor Western, but something entirely its own. We're traveling to Shanghai in the 1920s and 1930s, to the narrow alleyways and hidden chambers where shadows danced with smoke, and where thousands of souls sought refuge from a world that had become too heavy to bear. We're going to step very gently into the opium dens of old Shanghai, and listen to the stories that the smoke has kept secret all these years. But before we descend those worn wooden steps, let me paint for you the Shanghai that was. Picture, if you will, a city that had been carved up like a careful pastry, divided into concessions: French, British, American, each a small kingdom with its own laws, its own architecture, its own dreams. The year is 19. The streets hum with the music of a dozen languages, Mandarin mixing with English, French conversations interrupted by Yiddish, Russian émigrés speaking in hushed tones about the homeland they would never see again. This was a city where anything could be bought, sold, or forgotten, where white Russian countesses served tea in tiny apartments above noodle shops, where Jewish refugees from pogroms opened tailoring businesses next to Chinese silk merchants, where American jazz musicians played in clubs owned by green gang bosses. Shanghai was the ultimate refuge city, a place where people came not to find themselves but to lose themselves so completely that they might perhaps discover someone new. And in this city of reinvention, in this place where identities could be shed like old coats, the opium dens served as sanctuaries for a very particular kind of disappearing. Let me introduce you to someone. Her name was Lily Chen, though that wasn't the name she was born with nor the one she would die with. In 1923, at 17, she had arrived in Shanghai from a small village outside Hangzhou, carrying nothing but a cloth bundle and a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who worked in a textile factory. Like so many young women of her time, she had come to the city seeking work, seeking anything better than the life that awaited her in a village where the rice crops had failed 3 years running. But Shanghai had its own ideas about what young women like Lily were worth. The cousin she sought had long since moved on, or perhaps had never existed at all. The address on her letter led to an empty lot where weeds grew between broken bricks. And so, with nowhere to go and winter approaching, Lily found herself in the international settlement, accepting the kind of work that allowed her to eat but slowly devoured her soul. By 1925 you could find Lily most evenings in a particular opium den on Fuqiao Road, a place known simply as the Garden of Peaceful Dreams. The irony of the name was not lost on its patrons, for very few who descended those stairs ever found peace, and fewer still found dreams that didn't turn to ash by morning. The den itself was unremarkable from the street level, just a narrow doorway squeezed between a tailor's shop and a store selling imported cigarettes. A small sign in Chinese characters, easily missed unless you knew what to look for. But oh dear listener, the stories that doorway could tell. You descended wooden steps that creaked with the weight of 10,000 footsteps, each one belonging to someone seeking to escape something unbearable. The air grew thicker as you went down, heavy with the sweet cloying scent of opium smoke mixed with incense, sweat and something else, something harder to name, desperation perhaps, or hope. Sometimes the two smell remarkably similar. The main room was dim, lit by paper lanterns that cast amber shadows on walls lined with wooden bunks, each one draped with faded silk curtains. These were the beds where Shanghai's lost souls came to dream themselves away from the world above. Coolies who had worked 16-hour days at the docks lay next to British clerks who couldn't face another day of managing someone else's money. Chinese students who had lost their scholarships shared space with Russian dancers who had lost their theater. White missionaries who had lost their faith rested beside Chinese merchants who had lost their fortunes. And there in a corner bunk that had become her regular sanctuary lay Lily Chen, her dark eyes reflecting the lantern light as she drew slow, careful breaths from her pipe. But let's pause here, dear listener, because I want you to understand something important. When we talk about opium dens today, our minds often conjure images from sensational films or moralistic pamphlets, scenes of wild-eyed addicts and squalid hovels. The reality was far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more tragic. The opium dens of Shanghai were not places of wild abandon. They were places of profound quiet, sanctuaries where the volume of the world was turned down to a whisper. Patrons didn't come to get high in the modern sense. They came to get low, to sink beneath the surface of their pain, their homesickness, their disappointment, their fear. For someone like Lily, the den offered something precious: temporary invisibility. For a few hours she could disappear from a world that had made very clear what it thought she was worth. The opium didn't make her happy. It made her absent. And sometimes, dear listener, absence is the closest thing to peace that a person can find. The process itself was almost ritualistic in its gentleness. The opium was prepared by specialists, usually older Chinese men whose fingers moved with the precision of musicians. They would heat the black tar-like substance over a small flame until it bubbled and released its smoke. Then, using a long needle, they would collect a small amount and place it in the bowl of a bamboo pipe. The customer would lie on their side, head resting on a hard pillow, and inhale slowly, deeply, holding the smoke in their lungs until the world began to soften at the edges. What followed wasn't the dramatic stupor that Western newspapers love to describe. Instead, there was a gentle dissolving of anxiety, a softening of sharp edges, a warm feeling of being wrapped in invisible blankets. Time moved differently. Pain became distant, like thunder heard from many miles away. For people whose daily existence was a grinding series of small humiliations and large disappointments, this temporary reprieve felt like a gift from the gods. But gifts, as we know, often come with prices that only reveal themselves later. Let me tell you about Chen Wei-ming, the man who operated the Garden of Peaceful Dreams. He had been a university student once, studying literature and dreaming of becoming a teacher. But the revolution had come, and with it the need to make choices that nobody should have to make. By the time he reached Shanghai in 1919, his idealism had been ground down to something more practical: survival. Chen understood his customers in a way that perhaps only someone who had fallen could understand those still falling. He knew that the foreign businessman who came in every Tuesday evening wasn't trying to escape success, but the gnawing certainty that his success had been built on the suffering of others. He knew that the young Chinese woman who appeared every few days wasn't seeking pleasure, but temporary relief from circumstances that would have broken most people in half. Chen ran his establishment with a kind of melancholy dignity. He kept the pipes clean, the beds properly maintained, the atmosphere calm and respectful. He extended credit to those who needed it, knowing that debt was often the only thing that connected his customers to the world above. He asked no questions about names or histories, understanding that people came to his den precisely to escape such details. In quieter moments, usually in the early morning hours when the last customers had drifted away, Chen would sometimes sit in his small office above the den and write in a leather journal. He wrote about his customers, but not their names or their secrets. Instead, he wrote about their humanity. The way the hard-faced Russian colonel's eyes would soften when he thought no one was watching. The careful politeness with which the British widow always thanked him, as if good manners could somehow preserve her dignity in a place that society said had no dignity to preserve. These writings, discovered decades later in the walls of a building being demolished in the 1990s, provide us with some of our most intimate glimpses into the emotional landscape of Shanghai's opium dens. Chen had a poet's eye for detail and a philosopher's understanding of human nature. Through his words, we can begin to see these places not as dens of iniquity, but as informal hospitals for souls that the world above had broken. But let's return to Lily, whose story threads through this larger tapestry like smoke itself, visible one moment, dispersed the next, but always present. By 1927, Lily had been visiting the Garden of Peaceful Dreams for 2 years. What had begun as occasional refuge had become something more regular, more necessary. Her life above ground had stabilized in the way that desperate lives sometimes do. She had found steadier work, a small room of her own, even a few friendships with other women in similar circumstances. But the weight of her daily existence, the accumulation of small defeats and smaller victories, required increasingly frequent relief. She had what we might now recognize as complex trauma, not from any single catastrophic event, but from the grinding stress of existing in a world that offered women like her very few paths to dignity or security. The opium didn't cure this condition. It simply made it bearable. And perhaps, dear listener, in the context of her time and place, that was a kind of mercy. Chen Wei-ming noticed when Lily's visits became more frequent. He had seen this progression countless times before. The slow transformation from occasional customer to regular patron to someone for whom the den had become more home than the world above. But Chen was not a moralist, and he had learned long ago that judging people for their survival strategies was a luxury that people who ran opium dens could not afford. Instead, he showed Lily small kindnesses. He made sure her regular bunk was always available. He prepared her pipe with particular care. On cold nights, he provided extra blankets without being asked. These gestures might seem minor, but for someone whose daily life offered little gentleness, they represented something precious. Recognition of her humanity in a place where society insisted she had forfeited it. It's important to understand that the opium dens existed within a larger ecosystem of survival that had developed in Shanghai's margin. They were connected to boarding houses that asked no questions, to doctors who treated ailments without requiring legal names, to small restaurants that extended credit to hungry customers, to temples that offered sanctuary regardless of denomination or nationality. This was Shanghai's informal social safety net, created by and for people who had fallen through the cracks of more official systems. The dens weren't just places where people consumed opium. They were community centers for the displaced, communication hubs for the desperate, and sometimes the only places where certain conversations could safely happen. Political dissidents met in back rooms behind the bunks, speaking in whispers about organizing labor strikes or resisting foreign occupation. Refugees shared information about relatives lost in pogroms or revolutions, piecing together family histories across continents and years. Women like Lily formed quiet networks of mutual support, pooling resources and sharing survival strategies in the smoke-filled air. But as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Shanghai itself began to change in ways that would ultimately doom places like the Garden of Peaceful Dreams. The nationalist government, consolidating power under Chiang Kai-shek, had decided that Shanghai's international image needed cleaning up. The foreign concessions, once havens for activities that would have been illegal elsewhere, found themselves under increasing pressure to conform to more conventional moral standards. The British and French authorities, concerned about their diplomatic relationships with the new Chinese government, began to crack down on the opium trade that had once been a source of enormous tax revenue. At the same time, newer forms of intoxication were finding their way into Shanghai's underground economy. Heroin, cheaper and more potent than opium, began to appear in the city's drug market. Unlike opium, which required time and ritual and created a community of sorts among its users, heroin was a solitary drug that worked quickly and devastatingly. The careful ecosystem that had developed around the opium dens couldn't adapt to this harsher chemistry. Chen Wei-ming saw the writing on the wall earlier than most. His journal entries from 1931 speak of winds changing direction and flowers that bloom in different seasons. He began to prepare for the end of his world with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his management of it. In the summer of 1932, Lily Chen made her last visit to the Garden of Peaceful Dreams, not because she had overcome her need for escape, but because she had found a different kind of refuge. Through connections she had made in the den, she had secured passage on a ship bound for Hong Kong, where a Chinese-American family needed a governess for their children. It was not the fairy tale ending that Western narratives might demand, but it was something precious nonetheless. A chance to start again, to carry her scars into a new place where they might heal differently. Chen gave her a small gift as she left, a jade pendant that had belonged to his mother, not valuable enough to sell but meaningful enough to remember. For protection, he said, though they both understood that the kind of protection she needed couldn't be purchased or worn around the neck. The Garden of Peaceful Dreams closed 6 months later, not with a raid or a scandal, but with a simple sign posted on the door, closed for renovation. Chen returned to teaching, finding work in a school for refugee children. He never renovated the Instead, he let the building return slowly to the earth, the wooden bunks rotting away, the paper lanterns dissolving in Shanghai's humid air. By 1937, when the Japanese invasion brought a different kind of darkness to Shanghai, most of the old opium dens had disappeared. Some had been shuttered by the authorities, others had transformed themselves into different kinds of businesses. Still others had simply faded away as their customer base scattered to the winds of a changing world. But the stories remained, carried in the memories of people like Lily and Chen, passed down in whispered conversations and faded photographs, preserved in journals hidden in walls and letters never sent. What strikes me most about these stories, dear listener, is not the tragedy of addiction or the romance of forbidden places, but something more complex and more human. The profound human capacity to create meaning and community even in the darkest circumstances. The opium dens of Shanghai were many things: symptoms of social breakdown, products of economic desperation, refuges for the discarded and displaced. But they were also places where people who had been rendered invisible by the larger world found ways to see and be seen by each other. In our modern era, when we talk about addiction and recovery, we often focus on individual pathology and individual healing. But the opium dens remind us that addiction often flourishes in the soil of social disconnection, and that recovery, when it happens, usually requires not just individual will but community support and recognition of fundamental human dignity. The people who found their way to places like the Garden of Peaceful Dreams weren't fundamentally different from people who struggle with substances today. They were people dealing with trauma, displacement, economic insecurity, and social marginalization. They were people seeking connection, comfort, and temporary respite from circumstances that felt overwhelming. They were people who had been told in countless ways that they didn't matter, and who found in the smoky darkness of the dens a place where someone understood that they did. This doesn't romanticize their suffering or minimize the real harm that opium dependence caused in their lives and communities. But it does ask us to see their choices within the full context of their circumstances, and to recognize the humanity that persisted even in their most desperate moments. As Shanghai modernized and globalized in the decades that followed, the narrow alleyways where the opium dens once operated were widened into boulevards, the old buildings replaced with steel and glass towers. The city that had once been a haven for refugees and misfits transformed itself into a gleaming symbol of economic progress and international sophistication. But if you know where to look, and more importantly how to look, you can still find traces of that other Shanghai, in the way elderly residents still gather in small parks to play Shang-Chi and share gossip, in the informal networks that help migrant workers find housing and employment, in the quiet understanding that passes between people who have learned to survive by taking care of each other. The garden of peaceful dreams is gone, dear listener, and perhaps that's as it should be. The specific forms of suffering that it addressed have largely passed into history, but the human needs that it served, the need for sanctuary, for dignity, for recognition, for temporary respite from an overwhelming world, these needs persist. They find new expressions in new times, but they remain fundamentally unchanged. Perhaps this is what history teaches us most clearly, that human suffering takes different forms across eras, but the human capacity for compassion, even in the most unlikely places, even in the darkest circumstances, remains constant. The opium dens of Shanghai remind us that people create communities of care wherever they find themselves, and that the most profound acts of humanity often happen in the places that polite society prefers not to see. As we close our time together tonight, I want you to think about the lilies and chens in your own world, the people who exist at the margins, who have been rendered invisible by circumstances beyond their control, who seek refuge in ways that others might not understand or approve of. They are all around us, in every city and every era, carrying their own versions of jade pendants and leather journals, finding their own forms of temporary sanctuary. Their stories deserve to be told with the same gentleness and complexity that we've tried to bring to the opium dens of old Shanghai, not as moral lessons or cautionary tales, but as fully human narratives about the endless creativity people bring to the task of survival, and the profound connections they forge even in the most unlikely circumstances. Thank you, dear listener, for joining me on this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Your presence here, your willingness to listen to these difficult and beautiful stories, helps ensure that the humanity we've glimpsed tonight continues to live and breathe in our collective memory. If these stories have moved you, if they've helped you think about your own world in new ways, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more calm passages through time. Share your thoughts in the comments below, perhaps about the sanctuaries you've found in your own life, or the hidden histories you've discovered in your own communities. As you drift off to sleep tonight or begin your day, remember that history is not just about famous people and major events. It's about millions of individual human stories, each one as complex and worthy of understanding as Lily's journey through the alleyways of Shanghai. In remembering these stories, we honor not just the past, but the common humanity that connects us all across time and space. Sleep well, dear listener. Dream peacefully, and remember that even in the darkest places, people have always found ways to care for each other. Until next time.